It's been quite some time since FiiO released a new flagship DAC device, and the Q5 has been in the works for probably around 2 or 3 years now. So let's see if the long wait has paid off. To some extent, the Q5's design follows a deliberate theme along with FiiO's X7 Mark II, but in other aspects it's a totally new device for them. Whilst it sticks to the same principle of having a modular amplification stage, the rest of the design is more conservative than that of the X7 Mark II. Think of it like a combination between the X7 Mark II and the A5 amplifier. The Q5 doesn't have as many striking angles and lines, but it's still a very modern and attractive look nonetheless. The front of the device has a really nice looking brushed finish, whereas the rest of the body has a matte metallic finish, the same finish that's found on the X7 Mark II. Another similarity is the glowing LED section that's visible from between the main chassis and where the amp module is connected to the chassis. Moving on to the right side, we get an analog volume control which feels and looks very similar to the one found on the A5. There's also a power button, the same one that's found on the X7 Mark II, and a DSD indicator which lights up when the Q5 detects that a DSD data stream is being fed to it. Along the top we get a high and low gain switch, a bass boost switch, and an input combo port. Here we have a choice of connecting a 3.5mm coax input, a 3.5mm optical input, or a regular 3.5mm analog input if you only want to use the Q5 as an amplifier. And then lastly, we've also got a regular 3.5mm line out. The left hand side houses a couple of multifunctional buttons. When in Bluetooth mode, and only in Bluetooth mode, these buttons will act as regular play, pause and skip buttons. But as they cannot be used for those purposes when not in Bluetooth mode, the play, pause and skip forward buttons have been assigned additional functionality. The play pause button is used to switch the Q5 into or out of Bluetooth mode and is also used to put it into pairing mode. The skip forward button, on the other hand, is used to cycle between the various input modes except Bluetooth. However, this can only be done as long as there is no USB input connected to the Q5. The rear doesn't feature anything of particular interest other than a faux leather pad. This is somewhat similar to what we've seen on the Oppo HA2 and HA2 SE. It's unclear if FiiO intended for this design element to help avoid getting scratches onto the main body of the Q5, or if it's simply for aesthetics. If it is intended for the former, it'll be interesting to see how well it holds up over time. Will it start to peel off after a bit of wear and tear, or will it prove to be quite resilient to daily usage? In terms of functionality, the Q5 is a pretty straightforward device to use if you're an iOS user. Just connect it up and start playing music from your favorite music app. For Android users though, things aren't always as simple. In some cases, the Q5 will work flawlessly, whereas in other cases, the Q5 will try to charge itself from the connected device, resulting in a major battery drain on that source device. I tried to connect the Q5 to a Shanling M2S, Hadiz AP60, Samsung Galaxy S7 and even the new Nokia 8 Sirocco, but all of them showed this charging issue. The Q5 isn't just a simple DAC though, as it's got a couple of features up its sleeve. First up is the modular design, which enables you to swap out the amplification circuitry. This is the exact same feature that is found on FiiO's flagship X7 and X7 Mark II music players, and the Q5 even uses the exact same amp modules as those devices. Then we also get Bluetooth functionality. The Bluetooth 4.2 module implemented in the Q5 does offer both aptX and AAC compatibility, but unfortunately neither aptX HD nor LDAC. One really cool feature is, when the Q5 is connected to an Android or iOS device via Bluetooth, you can use FiiO's own music player app to apply various changes to the Q5. You can select between a few different digital filters, you can change the channel balance, and you can also opt to turn off the Q5's LED lights. Then there's another option which seems a bit odd. The Q5 has 2 separate micro USB ports, and so within the app there's an option to assign the one port to be a data port and the other to be a charging port. So of course, at first I thought this was the solution to getting the Q5 to work with my non-iOS devices without draining the batteries, but unfortunately that just wasn't the case. I assumed that if I simply made the bottom port to be a data port, that all will be golden, but nope, it doesn't change anything. So at this stage, exactly what the purpose of being able to make this change within the app is unclear to me. Okay, so let's get on to the sound. To be perfectly honest, when I first unboxed the Q5 and gave it a quick listen, I rather enjoyed the sound. It had an easygoing character and absolutely no harshness in the upper registers. But it's when I sat down and compared it to other products that the initial sense of enjoyment started to fade just a little bit. Perhaps that's not quite the right phrase to use. The Q5 still had an enjoyable sound, but it just wasn't quite as refined as I had initially thought. It just goes to show that you really do need to spend a bit more time listening to these products before jumping to any conclusions. So let's check out a couple of comparisons to see what I'm talking about. Okay, let's jump straight to the big boy, the iDSD Black Label. Whilst the Q5 might have somewhat of a leg up on the iFi in terms of features and styling, what it can't do is compete with it in terms of raw sonic quality and power. Compared to the iFi, the Q5 has a smoother and seemingly softer character. Instruments and other sounds just seem to lack some definition, and that leads to a less perceived instrument separation. That, in and of itself, affects the ability to place various sounds within the soundstage. As a result, the micro iDSD Black Label gives you a better sense of space, a property which becomes quite apparent when listening to orchestral music. That improved sense of space just gives your brain more clues as to the actual size of that orchestra. So what about the xdsd? Yep, another iFi product, but a very important comparison to make. The Q5 and xdsd have a few key things in common with one another. Both offer numerous digital inputs, including Bluetooth, and both have both single-ended and balanced outputs. The difference there being that the Q5's balanced connection is of the more popular 2.5mm variety, whereas the xdsd's connection is 3.5mm. The FiiO is somewhat more feature-rich, but loses out in available power output and sound quality. Comparing the sound of these two devices proved to be quite an eye-opener. iFi are just so incredibly skillful when it comes to implementing genuinely good audio into a device. Side by side and in a volume-matched battle, the xdsd just sounds like the more competent of the two devices. I'd say that the xdsd sounds perhaps closer to the X7 Mark II than it does the Q5. There's just less of that seemingly smeared smoothness and instead a more focused and engaging sound coming from the xdsd. So what about comparing the Q5 to the X7 Mark II and the X5 3rd generation? This was a very interesting comparison as it represents one of the biggest dilemmas for audiophiles when it comes to picking a portable rig. After you've been in this little game for a while, you'll inevitably find yourself asking the question, do I get a single source device, or do I forego some portability and convenience and instead stack a DAC to a source device? Well, this question usually pops up when someone considers the cost involved. Generally speaking, you'll usually pay less for a DAC device than what you would for an all-in-one music player of equal sound quality. I was really impressed with the sound quality of the X7 Mark II, especially when I compared it against the iDSD Black Label. And so when I got around to comparing the Q5 to the X7 Mark II, I felt that as far as sound quality is concerned, the X7 sits somewhere between the Q5 and the iFi. So if you're trying to decide between the Q5 and the X7 Mark II, with regards to sound quality at least, my pick would go to the X7, as it's still a step up from the Q5. So what about the X5 3rd Gen then? As far as FiiO's pricing scheme is concerned, this is perhaps the most important comparison to make. Depending on the region or various retail outlets, the Q5 and X5 are generally priced pretty close to one another. In some cases, the X5 would cost a little more than the Q5, and in other cases, it'll be the other way around. But remember what I said earlier about similarly sounding DAC devices usually costing less than standalone media players? Yeah, that rule is broken here. Honestly speaking, I don't think I'd be able to tell the Q5 and X5 3rd Gen apart in a proper blind test. This shouldn't really come as a surprise though, as both devices seem to be using the exact same dual AK4490EN DAC chip setup. But the fact that they are priced so similarly does come as a bit of surprise. So how would you go then about choosing between these two devices if they offer the same sonic quality and character? Well, The value of the Q5 is going to come down to what your needs are. Let's assume for a second that you've set yourself a budget of around $350 or so, and you've narrowed your choice down to either getting the Q5 or the X5 3rd Gen. I can tell you right now to forget about sound quality, as that property alone just isn't going to be a deciding factor here. Two of the three key aspects that will matter here though is convenience and functionality. The Q5 gives you the option to swap out amp modules if you need some more driving power, and can also decode DSD files up to DSD 256, whereas the X5 only does up to DSD 128. The third aspect to take into account is a big plus, at least for myself, and that is that you don't have to deal with FiiO's software if you take the Q5. Generally, I tend to be immensely underwhelmed with the software on their music players, so I consider not having to deal with that as being a big positive. One problem facing the Q5 though is the fact that unless you're an iOS user, you simply don't know for sure if the device is going to work properly with your source device. As mentioned, the Q5 was getting charged from all the non-iOS devices I tried, and so at least in my case, it just isn't a practical device to use. However, the biggest problem for the Q5 comes in the form of the iFi xdsd. Yes, it's got an arguably less attractive design than the Q5, and the Q5 will probably give you a bit longer total playback time, but the iFi also has more power available and, more importantly, offers a step up in outright sound quality. That $50 or so jump in cost over the Q5 really does seem worth it for the sound. Also, all you need to connect the xdsd to your source device is the appropriate OTG cable in the case of Android, or the camera connection kit for iOS devices. The xdsd also gives you the ability to decode MQA format files, whereas the Q5 lacks this entirely. Overall, the Q5 does seem like a good value product nonetheless. It's just a shame that FiiO seems more interested in making their products compatible with iOS rather than showing the Android crowd some love as well. Thank you so much for watching. If you've enjoyed this review, please hit that like button. If you've got any questions or comments, leave them down below, and I'll catch you in the next one. Cheers.